All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep into some pretty intense legal territory. We're talking about laws specifically focused on offenses against women and children.
Yeah, it's a heavy but important topic for sure.
Absolutely. And to guide us through this, we're going to be dissecting excerpts from pasted text, that hefty legal document.
Oh, yeah, I know it well.
Specifically Chapter 5, which really goes into detail about the framework of laws around these crimes.
It can be a bit dense, that's for sure.
It can be. It can be. But I think really unpacking these laws, going beyond just the surface is super crucial for everyone to understand.
For sure.
Yeah, ready to get into it.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay. So pasted text kicks things off with the definition of rape in Section 63.
Right.
And it's way more comprehensive than I think a lot of people might realize.
Yeah.
It covers various forms of penetration, different situations where consent's absent, really the whole 9 yards.
It's very specific.
But one of the things that really stood out to me in this whole definition was how much it emphasizes the idea of consent.
Consent is key, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's so interesting is that the law doesn't just stop at the absence of a no.
Right.
There's this explanation too in Section 63 that I think is worth pulling out and highlighting.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, it really clarifies that consent has to be unequivocal, meaning crystal clear, no room for misinterpretation.
Absolutely, crystal clear.
And it also stresses that it has to be voluntary, given freely.
Yeah.
And there's even this part that explicitly states that just because a woman doesn't physically resist doesn't automatically equal consent.
Yeah, they're trying to debunk that harmful myth that silence equals consent.
Yeah, the law is really trying to shatter those old, dangerous myths.
For sure.
Really making it clear that consent needs to be active, freely given, and that anything less than that is not acceptable.
It's laying down the law.
Exactly, exactly. So while this broad definition of rape is a big step forward, the text also lays out some exceptions.
Right, and they can be a bit tricky.
Yeah, there's one in particular, exception 2, that really made me pause.
I wonder which one you're thinking of.
It's the one that states that sexual intercourse by a man with his wife, as long as she's over 18, is not considered rape.
Ah, yes, that's a major point of contention.
It is, right.
A lot of people argue that this exception basically undermines the whole idea of consent within marriage. It creates this loophole that can be exploited, and it's a really stark example of how laws, even if they have good intentions, can sometimes reflect, kind of outdated societal norms rather than true equality.
Right.
It's definitely an area where we're seeing lots of legal reform happening around the world.
Yeah, it's this legal tug of war almost between traditional views of marriage and evolving ideas about women's autonomy and rights.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue.
It really is. It makes you wonder about the real world impact of this exception, how often it's used. Does it truly serve justice?
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure, but it definitely raises a lot of questions about the power dynamics within a marriage and whether the law actually protects women in those situations.
Yeah, some serious food for thought there. So moving on, let's talk about punishments, because that's what Section 64 outlines, the punishments for rape.
Right, the consequences.
Yeah, and we see that the general punishment is a minimum of 10 years, which could go all the way to life imprisonment plus a fine. But then Section 64, too, goes on to list some specific situations that carry even harsher penalties.
Right. It gets more specific.
Yeah. What's the reasoning behind those tougher punishments?
Well, Section 64, too, basically highlights the situations that are considered even more severe because of things like, the victim's vulnerability or the perpetrator's abuse of power. Think of things like rape by authority figures, rape during communal violence, or rape against a pregnant woman. These are seen as particularly heinous because of the context and the potential for even greater trauma.
Gotcha. So it's not just about the act itself, but also the circumstances surrounding it that kind of contribute to the severity of the crime.
Exactly. The law is recognizing that certain types of rape just inflict a much deeper level of harm and therefore deserve stronger legal consequences.
That makes sense. It's clear pasted text really pays attention to the age of the victim, too, especially when it comes to rape. Sections 65 and 66 go into the penalties for the rape of minors.
Yeah, that's a crucial area.
And those punishments, they get increasingly harsher as the victim gets younger. Like it even mentions the possibility of the death penalty in certain cases.
Right. It's highlighting a key aspect of the law, which is the recognition that children are just inherently more vulnerable.
Yeah.
The younger the child, the greater that power imbalance is, and the potential for lasting psychological and emotional harm is just huge. So the law takes this very, very seriously, as it should.
Absolutely. Speaking of vulnerability, pasted text also dives into that complicated issue of marital rape. Specifically, Section 67, which looks at a very specific scenario when the wife is living separately from her husband.
Right, that's an interesting one. For a long time, many legal systems didn't even recognize the concept of marital rape.
It's true.
So to see it addressed here, even within those specific conditions, it's a step towards recognizing that marriage doesn't automatically equal consent.
Yeah, like the law is catching up to this idea that consent within marriage is just as crucial as consent outside of marriage. And pasted text doesn't stop there. It goes on to cover other offenses too, like sexual harassment, voyeurism, stalking.
Yeah, it covers a lot of ground.
It does. What are some of the key things that we need to know about how those are defined?
Well, let's start with sexual harassment. Section 75 defines it pretty broadly. It includes unwelcome physical contact, demands for sexual favors, showing pornography without consent, even just making sexually colored remarks. The law really wants to capture all the different ways women can be harassed.
So it's not just about the physical act, but it's also about creating a hostile environment through words and actions.
Exactly. Then we have voyeurism, which is covered in Section 77. This one focuses on like the violation of privacy for sexual gratification. So think of someone watching or capturing images of a woman, in a private act without her consent.
Right.
And then maybe sharing those images. It's a huge violation.
It really is. And it makes you think about how technology has really blurred the lines here, like hidden cameras, online platforms. It's created all these new avenues for this type of offense.
Absolutely. Technology is definitely creating new challenges in terms of protecting privacy and consent. That's why it's so important for laws to keep evolving to address these new realities.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of evolving, let's talk about dowry, death, and cruelty, which are covered in Sections 80 and 85.
Yeah, heavy topics for sure.
These are heavy, really heavy topics that unfortunately still plague many parts of the world. So, how does pasted text address these issues?
Well, dowry death, as defined in Section 80, specifically talks about the death of a woman within 7 years of her marriage under circumstances that suggest, she was subjected to cruelty or harassment related to dowry demands.
Right.
And it doesn't stop there. Section 85 broadens that scope by criminalizing cruelty by the husband or his relatives, even if it doesn't result in death.
So it's not just about the tragic outcome of death, but it's also about recognizing that pattern of abuse, physical or mental, that can lead up to it.
Exactly. And what stood out to me is that the law actually defines cruelty pretty specifically.
Yeah, it's not just open to interpretation.
Nope. Section 86 actually lays it all out. It includes any intentional conduct that would likely drive a woman to suicide or cause serious harm to her, both physically and mentally. It also covers harassment that's intended to force her or her family to meet unlawful demands for property or valuables.
So they're acknowledging that emotional and psychological abuse can be just as damaging as physical violence, and the law is seeking to protect women from all of it.
It really is a crucial shift in how we think about domestic abuse.
It is. And speaking of consequences, pasted text dedicates an entire section to offenses against children, which we'll get into in just a bit. But before we do, what are your initial thoughts on everything we've talked about so far? What's jumping out at you?
Well, I think what strikes me the most is just how pasted text tries to grapple with all these really complex issues, through legal definitions, punishments, and explanations.
Right.
It's a reminder that laws are really a reflection of society's values and concerns, but also that they need to constantly evolve to address new challenges and changing ideas of what constitutes a crime.
It's fascinating how these laws try to capture all those nuances, like the power dynamics at play, especially in situations that involve women and children. But like you said, laws are just one piece of the puzzle, right? We need to look at the bigger picture of societal norms, cultural context, to really grasp the complexity of these issues. So before we move on to those offenses against children, I want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your initial reactions? What's resonated with you? What questions are swirling in your mind? Take a moment to reflect, and we'll be right back to continue unpacking this crucial chapter of the law.
It's pretty amazing how pasted text confronts all of these, sensitive issues, these often hidden issues, head on.
You're right, it doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
And one section that really got to me was Section 93, which deals with a parent or caregiver abandoning a child under 12 years old.
It's tough to even think about, but it really underscores how important it is for adults to protect kids that young, kids who are totally dependent on them.
Right.
Abandoning a child, like in a dangerous situation, leaving them helpless, there's a reason that's a serious crime.
Yeah, it makes you think about the kind of desperation that some parents might be facing to even consider, like, doing something like that.
Right.
Maybe it speaks to a lack of support systems or a fear of judgment. But the law is very clear. A child's safety has to come first.
Absolutely. It reminds us that all of these laws, we can't look at them in isolation. They exist within this web of, bigger societal issues like poverty, access to resources, cultural pressures, all of that.
Yeah, for sure. We can't just separate the legal stuff from the social context. Now, there's another offense that I found particularly disturbing. Section 94, which deals with concealing a birth by secretly disposing of a dead body.
Oh, man, that one raises so many questions. What would lead someone to that point?
Yeah.
That act of desperation. Is it an unwanted pregnancy? Fear of shame? Maybe violence within the family? It's scary to think about.
It's like you're trying to uncover this tragic story. Right behind all these legal terms, there are real human experiences and often a lot of pain and secrecy.
For sure.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and look at Section 96, which tackles what they call procurement, which is basically like tricking or forcing a child into having illicit intercourse.
Right.
So it's not just about the act of sexual abuse itself, but about the manipulation that happens beforehand.
Totally. The law is acknowledging here that children, especially young children, they're just so vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, deception, threats, promises. People can use all sorts of tactics to lure a child into a situation where they can exploit them. And the law sees that grooming process. That's a crime, too.
And the punishment for that is pretty severe, like up to 10 years imprisonment plus a fine.
Wow.
It's a pretty clear message that society is not going to tolerate that kind of exploitation of innocence.
No, absolutely not. And then, we move on to Section 97, which deals with kidnapping a child, specifically under 10 years old, to steal from them.
Yeah, it's like a double violation.
Yeah.
Not only are you kidnapping a child, which is already horrific, but you're also using their vulnerability to commit theft. It's awful.
Awful. And it really shows how these offenses can be interconnected, like you see again in Section 98, which talks about selling, hiring out, or disposing of a child for prostitution or illicit intercourse.
Right, and that gets to the heart of child trafficking, which is, just one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. And what's so important here is that it's not just about the act of using a child for those purposes, but about the systems that enable that exploitation.
Right, that make it possible.
Pasted text makes it clear that not only is it a crime to use a child for those things, but it's also a crime to help make it happen, to sell, hire out, or dispose of a child, knowing what they'll be subjected to.
It's about holding people accountable for creating, the supply chain of this awful industry. It's saying even if you're not the one directly abusing the child, if you're profiting from their exploitation, you're guilty.
Right.
And the penalties there are severe, too. Up to 10 years imprisonment and a fine. The law is very clear on this. It's an absolutely abhorrent crime.
And that focus on accountability continues in Section 99, which focuses on the other side of the equation, the people who are buying, hiring, or obtaining possession of a child for those purposes.
The demand side.
Yeah, the demand side. Prostitution, illicit intercourse, any other kind of exploitation. So by criminalizing both the supply and demand, the law is trying to disrupt this whole system of child trafficking and exploitation.
It's a complex problem. It requires a multi-pronged approach, for sure.
And the punishments for fueling that demand, they're even harsher. Like imprisonment can range from 7 to 14 years plus a fine.
Wow.
So they're really sending a message like, if you create the demand, if you're the one seeking to exploit a child, you're going to face the full force of the law.
That's a powerful message.
It is. It's been a really heavy journey going through all of these sections of pasted text, that's for sure. As we wrap up this part of our exploration, what's kind of standing out to you? What's at the forefront of your mind?
I think what really hits me is how the law is trying to protect children. It's trying to anticipate the ways they can be exploited and not just reacting to abuse after it's already happened.
Right.
It recognizes just how vulnerable they are, and it's trying to build in safeguards.
Right. It's about putting a legal framework in place that acknowledges those power dynamics and, like you said, tries to prevent the abuse before it happens.
Exactly. But it's also important to remember, we talked about this before, the law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's all tangled up with social and economic realities, cultural beliefs, support systems, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be back to wrap up our deep dive into pasted text and really discuss its implications when it comes to protecting women and children. But before we move on, I want to hear from you, our listener. What's resonating with you? What questions are you wrestling with as we unpack all of these, complex legal provisions? Take a moment, give it some thought, and we'll be right back to finish our exploration. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into pasted text. We've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
exploring how the law tries to protect women and children.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. But before we wrap things up, there's one more section I want to touch on. Section 80, which deals with an issue we talked about earlier, dowry death.
Right, that's a big one.
It is. And this section really takes direct aim at this horrific crime. I mean, pasted text defines dowry death as the death of a woman within 7 years of her marriage.
7 years.
Yeah, under circumstances that suggest she was subjected to cruelty or harassment by her husband or his relatives, and all of that stemming from dowry demands.
It's terrible that such a specific law even needs to exist, but it's a reality for so many women.
It is. It's a sad reality. And it's not just about a woman dying within 7 years of marriage. The law is very clear that there has to be evidence, right? Like a pattern of cruelty or harassment that's directly related to those dowry demands.
Exactly. There needs to be that clear link between the abuse and the dowry. And remember, dowry here, it's defined the same way as in the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961. So you can really see how different laws, they kind of work together to try and tackle this complex issue.
It's all connected. What I find so powerful about Section 80 is that it puts this presumption of guilt on the husband or his relatives in certain cases. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means and why it's so important?
Sure. So a presumption of guilt, it basically flips the burden of proof. Normally in a trial, the prosecution, they have to prove the defendant's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But in cases of dowry death, when certain conditions are met, the law automatically assumes that the husband or his family is guilty unless they can prove otherwise.
So it's like the law is saying, we know this happens and we're not going to make it easy to get away with it.
Right. It reflects the fact that, unfortunately, dowry deaths often happen within a family, where the victim might be isolated, afraid to speak out. So this presumption of guilt helps even the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, I see. It's about recognizing those power dynamics, that potential for abuse that can happen.
Yeah.
Especially within those close relationships. And it's not just about punishing the act of dowry death itself. Section 85, it widens the scope a bit. It addresses cruelty by the husband or his relatives, even if it doesn't lead to death.
Yeah, that's important because it acknowledges that abuse doesn't have to end in death to be a crime, right?
Right.
The law is saying even if a woman survives, she might still be going through horrible physical or psychological abuse because of dowry demands, and that's not okay.
Absolutely. And when we talk about cruelty here, it's not just physical violence, right?
Exactly. Section 86 lays out a very clear definition of what cruelty means in this context, and it includes both physical and mental harm. So we're talking any intentional conduct that would likely drive a woman to suicide.
Wow.
Or cause serious injury or put her life, her limb, her health in danger. It even includes harassment that's meant to force her or her family to give in to those unlawful demands for property or valuable security.
So they're recognizing that emotional and psychological abuse, it can be just as damaging as physical violence.
Absolutely. It's a huge shift in how we think about domestic abuse.
It is. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Chapter 5 of pasted text, I think it's important to take a step back and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
These laws, they give us this glimpse into the society that created them. So what do you think they're telling us?
Well, they definitely tell us that this is a society wrestling with some serious problems. We're talking violence against women, exploitation of children, abuse within families, and it's a society that's trying to deal with those problems, to address them through legal means, but it's also a society that's still, evolving in how it understands these really complex issues.
It's almost like holding up a mirror, isn't it, to society's values, its anxieties, its struggles. And while laws are a reflection of those values, they can also be a force for change, right?
Yes, exactly. Laws send a powerful message about what a society considers acceptable or unacceptable. They provide a framework for holding people accountable, for protecting victims.
They do. But laws alone, they're not enough. It's about changing hearts and minds, too, challenging harmful cultural norms. It's about creating a society where these offenses aren't just illegal, they're unthinkable.
Right. And that takes a multi-pronged approach. We need education, social support systems, and a real commitment to addressing those root causes of the problems.
Mm.
It's a long road, but these laws, they give us somewhere to start.
Yeah, they give us a foundation. This deep dive into pasted text has been eye-opening, to say the least. I mean, we've explored some pretty dark aspects of human behavior, but we've also seen how the law tries to bring justice to protect those who need it most. What are your final thoughts as we close out our deep dive?
I think the main thing to remember is that these laws, they give us a way to understand the complexities of violence and exploitation, but they also remind us that creating a truly just and equitable society that takes all of us working together, it's a responsibility we all share.
And to you, our listeners, we leave you with this. Think about the role you can play in creating a world where the offenses we've talked about, the ones laid out in pasted text, they become things of the past. How can you help build a society where women and children are safe, respected, and empowered? These aren't easy questions, but they're questions worth asking. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into pasted text.